In this lecture, we're going to talk about types of selection. There are three main types of selection that are going to be used in order to cause or to force natural selection. The very first type of selection is called directional selection. This is when the selection is for one of the ends of a bell curve. It causes the curve to shift one direction or the other in the following generations. What this looks like, if you have out a graph, X and Y axis, say we were looking at finches because that was Darwin's favorite organism to look at. One of the main characteristics that he looked at was beak size. So I'm going to make that my x-axis. On my y-axis is going to be the number of birds that I looked at. Now, in a population, it's going to look very much like a bell curve, where I have a nice little line like this, where it goes up and then it comes back down. And the big thing about a bell curve is that I have equal numbers of individuals on either side of the bell curve. That's what makes a bell curve. These two areas should be equal. With a directional curve, what happens is one of the ends is going to be selected for, and that will cause a shift in the bell curve, and it kind of gives the change in beak size. So for this one, I'm going to choose this end of my bell curve. This is my successful end. So in the next generation, I'm going to have more birds with slightly larger beaks. What this causes is for my bell's curve to shift over just a little bit. And I would end up with a bell curve that looks more like this, where it's moved over from where it started. What I chose back here with the circled bit, this end of the bell curve, that orange bit, are going to be individuals with better fitness. They're more likely to survive in order to reproduce. So you can tell from going from orange to blue, I have an increase in my beak size. Those individuals, the ones with the slightly bigger beak, are going to be the ones that are going to survive, and then they pass that gene on to the next generation. The second type of selection is called stabilizing. This is when the selection is for the middle of the bell curve. Continue on to the next page. The narrowing range of phenotypes. What this one would look like, say I am looking at birth mass on my x-axis, and on my y-axis, I'm looking at the number of babies born within that. Normal bell curve, you'd have something that looks like this. For this one, with stabilizing, I'm selecting the middle of my bell curve. These are the individuals with better fitness. They're the ones that are going to survive. They have a better chance of survival. So what happens when you change that and you start looking at the bell curve that's going to exist afterwards, you pick the middle. So it narrows the number of phenotypes that you're going to see. So you're going to see a lot more babies right in this range. And so it narrows my bell curve because most of my individuals are going to be in the middle of this bell curve. And that's where that one goes. The last type of selection that we are going to talk about is disruptive selection. This is when the selection is for one or the other extremes of the bell curve. For this one, say we went back to beak size, and then up my y-axis would be the number of birds again. So nothing's changed from that very first graph that I did. For this one, you're still going to have the exact same bell curve, starting out with this. However, what you're choosing for this one is slightly different. You're choosing the extremes. So what I'm actually doing is choosing the sides of my bell curves. I'm not choosing what is typical, which would be the top of my bell curve. I'm not choosing them. I'm not choosing the ends where I have very few individuals. I'm not choosing any of those. I'm choosing the stuff in the middle. So once again, these two things in green, these are individuals for this day and age, for this climate, for this habitat, for whatever conditions are going on right now. These individuals have better fitness. They're the ones that are going to survive and pass on their genes. What this does to my bell curve is totally different. I'm going to start out and kind of go all the way up, have a little valley where I should have a peak, and then I'm going to come back down because I selected for the two extremes. So I have some more of like a camelback going on, where my two extremes are now the more dominant beak size. For this one is unique with disruptive. If the selective forces, whatever they happen to be, whether it's change in habitat, change in climate, whatever it is, change in the amount of food, change in the type of food, whatever is driving this selective force, if the selection is strong enough and lasts long enough, the curve can split in two. What this leads to is something we'll talk about in another lecture, and that is speciation, forming two different species. Usually you have the one, but if a disruptive selection comes into play, you can actually drive the separation of species in making it into two very different species. That is the end of this lecture. I will see you in class.